The champagne flutes clinked, a sound that usually signaled a celebration. But that night, it sounded like breaking glass inside my soul. My mother leaned back in her mahogany chair, her laughter sharp and jagged, as my younger sister, Chloe, held up my original design sketches and called them uninspired doodles to a room full of our family's social circle. The mockery was cruel, but the real sting was the diamond necklace Chloe was wearing, a piece she had bought with the dividends from my own company, the company they had just finished legally stripping away from me while I was still in a hospital bed. They weren't just laughing at my talent. They were toasting to the fact that they had successfully turned me into a stranger in my own life, convinced that I was too broken to ever fight back. To understand how I ended up standing in the shadows of my own dining room, watching my mother and sister celebrate my ruin, you have to understand the life I had built before the rot set in. 5 years ago, my world felt like it was woven from silk and sunlight. I remember the exact smell of my first design studio, a heady, intoxicating mix of fresh cedar shavings, expensive linen, and the bitter, grounding aroma of the double espresso I'd drink at 5 in the morning. I had built aura interiors from a single charcoal sketch pad and a mountain of student loans. Every client I landed, every custom-carved chair I designed, was a brick in the fortress of my independence. I was the girl who worked until her fingers bled, the one who didn't sleep until every fabric swatch was perfect. At the center of this world was The Croft, a crumbling Victorian estate on the edge of the city that I had purchased with my first major profit. It was a wreck when I bought it, but I saw the soul beneath the peeling wallpaper. I spent 3 years meticulously restoring it, doing much of the work with my own hands. I knew every creak in the oak floorboards, every secret of the custom-stained glass windows I'd installed in the foyer. The house wasn't just property. It was a living portfolio of my soul, a sanctuary where the light hit the breakfast nook just right at 7 a.m., casting a golden glow over everything I owned. My husband, Mark, was the man I thought would share this sanctuary forever. He was a high school history teacher, steady, soft-spoken, and seemingly content to be the quiet support to my ambitious fire. He'd bring me takeout when I worked late into the night at the studio, kissing my temple and whispering how proud he was of my empire. I loved that he wasn't part of the cutthroat business world. I thought his simplicity was my anchor. When I'd come home exhausted, the smell of the eucalyptus candles he'd light for me would immediately lower my blood pressure. He was my safe harbor, or so I told myself every night as I drifted off to sleep. Then there was my mother, Diana. She was a woman who wore pearls to breakfast and used her elegance as a silencer. She had always treated my success as a family asset rather than an individual achievement, as if my hard work was merely a natural extension of her superior DNA. "We did well with that luxury hotel contract, didn't we, Elena?" she'd say at Sunday dinners, her eyes scanning my expensive watch with a predatory glint, even though her only contribution to the project had been criticizing my choice of marble. She had a way of making me feel like a child playing with her toys, even as I was the one paying for her monthly wellness retreats and her designer wardrobe. My sister Chloe was the polar opposite of me, a whirlwind of expensive tastes and zero direction. She had floated through her 20s on a cloud of my mother's indulgence and my financial generosity. She was always finding herself, a process that apparently required first-class tickets to Bali and a constant stream of loans from my business account that she never intended to repay. Chloe viewed my work ethic with a sort of pitying amusement, You're so obsessed with your little floor plans, Elle, she'd say, lounging on my velvet sofa with a glass of wine I'd paid for. Don't you ever want to actually live? For a long time, I let it slide. I was the successful one, and I felt a heavy, ingrained responsibility to take care of them. I thought that by giving them a piece of my world, I was protecting them. I didn't realize I was actually feeding a pair of parasites that were slowly growing large enough to swallow me whole. The first real hint of the darkness came during a quiet dinner at the Croft, 6 months before everything imploded. My mother had been unusually attentive, commenting on the rising property values in our neighborhood and the excessive size of my design studio's reserve fund. "It's a lot of responsibility for one woman, Elena," she had remarked, her voice as smooth as cream. "And with you and Mark thinking about a family, perhaps it's time to think about a more collective management style for the business, to protect the legacy." I remember the way the silver fork felt heavy in my hand, the sudden, inexplicable chill that ran down my spine despite the warmth of the fireplace. I looked at Mark, expecting him to laugh it off, to remind her that I had built this from nothing. But Mark didn't look at me. He kept his eyes fixed on his plate, carefully cutting his steak, his silence a sudden, vast canyon between us. I brushed it off as him being polite to his mother-in-law, a small moment of awkwardness in an otherwise perfect life. I didn't know then that the collective management she spoke of was already being planned in the shadows, and that my sanctuary was already being measured for its new occupants. I didn't know that the people I loved most were already counting the days until I was out of the way. The shift in the atmosphere didn't happen with a bang. It was a slow, suffocating fog that crept into the corners of my life. A few weeks after that dinner, I collapsed in my studio. The doctors called it extreme physical exhaustion and a minor cardiac event brought on by stress. I was 34 years old. I spent 10 days in a hospital bed, my world reduced to the rhythmic beep of a heart monitor and the sterile smell of antiseptic. During those 10 days, my mother was a constant, hovering presence. She smoothed my hair with a hand that felt like ice and told me not to worry about a thing. "Mark and I have it all under control, darling," she whispered. "Just rest. Your empire won't crumble in a week." When I finally returned to the Croft, the house felt colder, as if the walls themselves were holding a secret. I was still weak, my movements slow and deliberate. Mark was different too. The man who used to be my safe harbor now seemed like a ghost haunting our shared hallways. He wouldn't look me in the eye. When I asked about the studio's quarterly filings, he'd fumble with his wedding ring and mutter something about letting Diana handle the paperwork so I could recover. "Since when does my mother handle my corporate filings, Mark?" I asked one afternoon, sitting in the breakfast nook that no longer felt golden. "She's just trying to help, Elena," he said, his voice thin and strained. He was standing by the sink, his back to me, scrubbing a plate that was already clean. "You almost died. Don't you think you've done enough? Maybe it's time to let the family carry the weight for a while." "The family didn't build Aura Interiors," I snapped, the first spark of my old fire flickering in my chest. "I did." He didn't respond. He just kept scrubbing, the sound of the sponge against the ceramic sharp and rhythmic, like a countdown. A few days later, I noticed Chloe driving a new Range Rover. When I asked her how she afforded a $100,000 car when she was supposedly between jobs, She just gave me a cat-like smile and adjusted her sunglasses. It's a gift, Elle, from someone who actually appreciates what I bring to the table. The first real crack in the facade appeared on a Tuesday morning. I was looking for my passport in the mahogany desk in our shared home office. I pulled the bottom drawer too hard and it popped off its tracks, revealing a hidden compartment I hadn't noticed before. Inside was a thick, cream-colored envelope. My heart began a slow, heavy thud against my ribs. I opened it, expecting tax documents or insurance papers. Instead, I found a notice of ownership transfer for Aura Interiors. My breath hitched. I flipped the page. There was my signature, bold, elegant, and completely forged, granting full executive control and 51% of the shares to a newly formed holding company, the Diana Rose Trust. My vision blurred. I sat on the floor, the cold wood pressing against my thighs, and kept reading. There was a second document, a lien against the croft. My house. My sanctuary. It had been used as collateral for a massive business loan I had never authorized. And there, at the bottom of the witness line, was a signature I recognized as clearly as my own. Mark. The room began to tilt. A high-pitched ringing started in my ears, drowning out the sound of the wind outside. It felt like the air had been sucked out of the room, leaving me gasping in a vacuum. My hands began to shake so violently that the papers rattled like dry leaves. I felt a wave of nausea so intense I had to lean my head against the desk to keep from vomiting. Elena? I didn't hear him come in. Mark was standing in the doorway, holding 2 cups of herbal tea. He saw the papers in my hand, and the cups hit the floor. The ceramic shattered, and the pale green liquid seeped into the rug I had imported from Istanbul. The rug I had bought to celebrate our 3rd anniversary. I can explain, he whispered. His face was ghostly pale, his features sagging with a mix of guilt and terror. I tried to speak, but my throat felt like it was filled with broken glass. I looked at the man I had slept beside for years, the man I thought was my anchor, and I realized I didn't know him at all. He wasn't an anchor. He was the weight that was intended to drown me. Explain what, Mark? I finally managed to choke out. My voice sounded like it belonged to someone else, someone older, someone colder. Explain why my mother owns my company? Or why you signed away the roof over our heads while I was hooked up to an IV drip? We did it for you, he burst out, his voice cracking. He took a step toward me, but I flinched back as if he'd tried to strike me. The doctor said the stress was killing you. Diana said if we took the pressure off, if we moved the assets into a trust where you wouldn't have to worry about the day-to-day, you could finally breathe. She said it was the only way to save you. To save me? I let out a sharp, jagged laugh that felt like a sob. You stole my life to save me? Who is we, Mark? You and my mother? Or you, my mother, and Chloe's new Range Rover? He went silent. That terrible, heavy silence that had been growing between us for months finally solidified into a wall of granite. He dropped his gaze to the floor, staring at the shattered teacups. He didn't defend me. He didn't say he'd made a mistake. He just stood there, paralyzed by his own cowardice, while the magnitude of their betrayal settled into my bones. I stood up, my legs feeling like they were made of water, but I forced myself to walk past him. As I reached the door, I stopped. I didn't look at him. You weren't saving me, Mark, I said, my voice barely a whisper, but cutting through the air like a blade. You were just making sure that when I finally woke up, I'd have nothing left to live for. But you forgot one thing. I turned my head just enough to see his profile. I'm the one who built this, and I'm the only one who knows how to tear it down. I didn't wait for Mark to find his voice. I grabbed the folder, my car keys, and a heavy coat, and I drove. I drove with a white-knuckled grip on the steering wheel, the road ahead blurring as tears of pure, molten rage finally broke through. I didn't go to a police station, not yet. I went to the source. I went to my mother's sprawling estate, the one I had paid the mortgage on for the last 3 years. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw the lights of the dining room glowing with a festive warmth. Through the large French windows, I saw them. My mother, Diana, looking radiant in emerald silk. Chloe, draped in that stolen diamond necklace. And a few of their high society friends who always hovered where the money was. I could hear the muffled sound of their laughter even before I killed the engine. It was a sound that made my skin crawl, like insects under the surface. I walked in without knocking. The heavy oak door thudded against the wall, cutting through the chatter like a gunshot. The room went silent. Chloe froze, a piece of expensive brie halfway to her mouth. My mother didn't flinch. She simply set her wineglass down and looked at me with a mask of elegant pity. "Elena, darling," she said, her voice smooth and patronizing. "You should be in bed. You look peaked." "I found the papers, Mother," I said. My voice was surprisingly steady, though my heart was hammering against my ribs so hard I thought it might crack a bone. I walked to the table and slammed the folder down onto the white linen cloth, right next to a platter of oysters. "I found the forged signatures. I found the lien on my house. I found the trust." Chloe let out a sharp, mocking laugh, the sound I had heard when I first arrived. "Oh, stop being so dramatic, Elle. You were practically a vegetable in that hospital. Someone had to keep the lights on. You should be thanking us for taking the burden off your plate." "The burden?" I stepped closer to her, and for the first time, she shrank back. "You mean the company I built while you were failing out of your 3rd art school? The company that paid for that car you're driving? That's not a burden, Chloe. That's my life." My mother stood up then, her movements slow and deliberate. She walked around the table, the silk of her dress hissing against the floor. "Elena, let's not make a scene in front of guests. You're clearly not yourself. The stress has clouded your judgment. We did what any loving family would do. We protected the assets before your condition could devalue them." "My condition?" I whispered, the absurdity of it hitting me like a physical blow. "You mean the exhaustion caused by me supporting all of you? And what about Mark? How did you get him to sign, Mother? Was it the good of the family, or did you just buy him off?" Diana smiled, a small, chilling expression that never reached her eyes. "Mark is a practical man. He realized that a wife who is constantly on the verge of a breakdown isn't much of a partner. We've made arrangements for him too. He's much happier now that he doesn't have to live in your shadow." That was the first twist that gutted me. It wasn't just that they had stolen the business. They had been poisoning my marriage for months, whispering in Mark's ear that I was the reason he felt small. "And there's more, since you're so intent on clarity," Chloe added, her voice dripping with malice. She leaned forward, her eyes gleaming. We've already signed the intent to sell Aura Interiors to Vantage Group. You know, the firm you spent 3 years fighting in court. They're buying the brand, the patents, and the client list. The deal closes on Friday. And as for your precious Croft, the sale is already pending. A developer wants the land. It's being demolished for luxury condos. The world seemed to slow down. I felt a cold sweat break out on my forehead, and the room began to spin. My house, my sanctuary, the place where I had painstakingly restored every inch of wood. They weren't just taking my money, they were erasing my history. "You're destroying it?" I whispered, my voice breaking. "Everything I built?" "We're liquidating," Diana corrected coldly. "You were always too sentimental, Elena. That's why you almost died. You don't have the stomach for real business. We're doing you a favor. You'll have a small monthly allowance from the trust, enough for a modest apartment and your medical needs, provided you remain cooperative." I looked at her, truly looked at her, and saw the monster behind the pearls. She didn't love me. She never had. I was just a high-yield investment that she had finally decided to cash out. At that moment, the door opened behind me. It was Mark. He looked disheveled, his eyes red. He saw me, then he saw the documents on the table, and he stopped dead. "Mark," I said, turning to him, "they're selling the house. They're selling the company to Vantage. Did you know that part? Did you know they were going to tear down the home we built together?" Mark looked at me, then at Diana. His mouth opened, then closed. He looked like a child caught in a lie, terrified and small. He didn't come to my side. He didn't apologize. He just stood there, his silence a deafening roar in the room. I thought it was for the best," he stammered, his eyes darting to the floor. "Diana said it was the only way to pay off everything." "Pay off what, Mark?" I demanded. "The debts," my mother interrupted, her voice like a whip. "Your husband has a bit of a habit, Elena. High-stakes poker hasn't been kind to him lately. He owed quite a lot to some very unpleasant people. We stepped in to save him, and you, from the scandal. In exchange, he helped us secure the transition of the company. It was a very fair trade." The second twist hit harder than the first. My steady, simple husband was a gambler who had sold my life's work to cover his losses. The betrayal was absolute. It was a circle of vultures, and I was the carcass they were fighting over. "Is that it?" I asked, looking from Mark to my mother, then to Chloe. "Is there any other part of my soul you've put a price tag on?" "Don't be dramatic, Elena," Chloe sighed, checking her manicure. "You still have your health. Mostly." I felt something inside me snap. It wasn't the sound of something breaking, it was the sound of a lock clicking into place. The trembling in my hands stopped. The nausea vanished, replaced by a cold, crystalline clarity that was sharper than any blade. I looked at the champagne flutes, the oysters, the designer clothes, all of it bought with my sweat and blood. "You think you've won," I said, my voice now a low, dangerous hum. "We haven't won, Elena," Diana said, smoothing her skirt. "We've simply taken charge, and there's nothing you can do. The documents are notarized. The trust is legal. You are, for all intents and purposes, a ward of this family now." I picked up the folder from the table. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I looked my mother straight in the eyes, and for the first time in my life, she was the one who looked away first. You're right about one thing, Mother, I said, my voice echoing in the silent room. I have been too sentimental. I thought love was a reason to be generous. I thought family was a reason to be blind. I turned to Mark, who was still hovering by the door like a shadow. And you weren't even worth the effort of hating. I walked toward the door. As I passed Chloe, she smirked. What are you going to do, Elle? Cry to your lawyer? We already put him on a retainer as company counsel. He works for us now. I stopped at the threshold and looked back at the room full of people who thought they had buried me. No, Chloe, I said, a slow, predatory smile spreading across my face. I'm not going to cry. I'm going to do something I should have done years ago. I'm going to show you exactly what happens when you try to steal a fire you didn't build. You wanted the business? You've got it. But you forgot that I'm not just the owner. I'm the architect. And I know exactly where the load-bearing walls are. I walked out into the night, the cold air filling my lungs like a tonic. They thought I was a victim. They thought I was broken. But as I started my car, I realized they had made a fatal mistake. They had left me with nothing left to lose, and a mind that knew exactly how to dismantle everything they loved. The next 48 hours were a blur of cold caffeine and glowing computer screens. I didn't go back to the Croft. I checked into a small, nondescript hotel under my maiden name and called the one person I knew my mother couldn't buy. Sarah, my former head of operations, whom Diana had fired the second I was hospitalized. When Sarah arrived at my room, she didn't offer platitudes. She opened her laptop and showed me what she'd been quietly documenting while I was in a coma-like fog. They thought I was gone, Elena, she whispered, her eyes sharp. But they forgot I still had the remote access codes to the secondary server. Chloe hasn't just been spending your dividends. She's been laundering company funds through a fake marketing firm she set up. And Mark? He didn't just sign those papers. He provided the bank with the proof of your mental incapacity. The transformation inside me was final. The heat of my anger had cooled into a hard blue diamond of resolve. I wasn't just a designer anymore. I was a strategist. We worked through the night, tracing the digital breadcrumbs of their greed. By dawn, I had what I needed. I didn't just have proof of their betrayal. I had the kill switch for the entire deal with Vantage Group. Friday morning arrived, gray and drizzly. The boardroom at the Vantage Group headquarters was a shrine to corporate arrogance, all glass, steel, and expensive silence. My mother, Diana, sat at the head of the polished oak table, looking like a queen about to be crowned. Chloe was beside her, scrolling through a luxury real estate app, already spending the millions they expected from the sale. Mark sat at the far end, staring at his hands, a man who had sold his soul and realized too late he'd been underpaid. The Vantage CEO was leaning forward, pen in hand, ready to sign the acquisition of Aura Interiors. Everything seems to be in order, he said. The assets, the brand, and most importantly, the exclusive rights to the Elena Vance design patents. Actually, I said, pushing the heavy glass doors open. The silence that followed was absolute. Diana's face didn't just pale. It seemed to age 10 years in a single second. Chloe dropped her phone, the screen shattering on the floor. Mark looked up, and for the first time, I saw pure, unadulterated terror in his eyes. Elena, my mother hissed, her voice a low warning. Get out of here. You're having another episode. I'm not the one who's about to have an episode, Mother, I said, walking to the table and placing a single, thin folder in front of the CEO. I didn't look at my family. I looked at the man with the pen. If you sign that contract, you're buying a hollow shell. My mother and sister are attempting to sell you intellectual property that they do not own. That's a lie, Chloe shrieked, standing up. The trust owns everything. The trust owns Aura Interiors, the corporate entity, I said, my voice calm and resonant. But if you look at the original filings from 5 years ago, documents my mother evidently never bothered to read, you'll see that all design patents and the Elena Vance trademark are held by a separate holding company, Vance Creative. And that company is not, and has never been, part of the Diana Rose Trust. It is owned solely by me, personally. Without my signature, you're buying a brand name you can't use and a portfolio of designs you have no right to manufacture. The CEO froze. He looked at the documents I'd provided, then at Diana. His expression shifted from professional interest to icy disgust. Is this true? Diana opened her mouth, but for once, no elegant lies came out. She looked at the papers, her hands trembling. She had been so focused on stealing the money in the bank and the house on the hill that she'd ignored the very foundation of the business. And there's more, I continued, turning to the 2 men in dark suits who had been waiting in the hallway. They stepped into the room, gold shields glinting on their belts. This is Detective Miller from the Fraud and Financial Crimes Division. He has the forensic evidence of the forged signatures on the ownership transfer, as well as the paper trail of the embezzlement my sister has been conducting for the last 6 months. The room erupted. Chloe started to scream, a high, thin sound of a cornered animal. My mother collapsed back into her chair, her regal posture crumbling into the heap of an old, defeated woman. But it was Mark I looked at. He was weeping, silent tears streaming down his face as the detective stepped toward him. You said you were saving me, Mark, I said, standing over him. He wouldn't look up. But the only thing you saved was your own skin, and even that you did poorly. Elena, please, he sobbed. I can explain. Don't, I interrupted, the word hitting him like a physical blow. The only thing I want to hear from you is your confession to the police. Anything else is just noise. The fallout was spectacular. The deal with Vantage Group collapsed instantly, leaving my mother and sister liable for millions in broken contract penalties. Because they had already spent the advance on Chloe's debts and Diana's lifestyle, they were forced into a humiliating public bankruptcy. The Diana Rose Trust was dissolved by court order. My mother lost her estate, her jewels, and her standing in the society she worshipped. Chloe was indicted for corporate embezzlement. She's currently serving a 3-year sentence, her Range Rover life replaced by a gray cell and a communal dining hall. Mark was charged with fraud and forgery. He took a plea deal that kept him out of prison, but he lost everything else. He's back in his hometown now, living in his parents' basement, working a job that barely covers the restitution he owes me. I haven't spoken to him since that day in the boardroom. As for me, I didn't just survive, I rebuilt. It took a year of grueling legal battles to clear the lien on the croft, but I did it. I kept the house. 6 months later, I'm sitting in my breakfast nook. The morning sun is hitting the table at that perfect angle, turning the room into a sanctuary of gold and shadow. The smell of fresh cedar and linen fills the air. I've moved my studio back into the house, smaller now, more intimate. I don't have an empire anymore, and I don't want one. I have my work, my integrity, and a silence that is no longer heavy with secrets. I pick up my coffee, the warmth of the ceramic grounding me. Looking out over the gardens I planted myself, I realize that the heart attack wasn't the end of my life. It was the beginning of my sight. My family thought they could steal my world because they didn't understand how it was made. They thought the house, the company, and the money were the things that made me powerful. They were wrong. The power was never in the things I owned. It was in the fact that I was the one who knew how to create them from nothing. And as I pick up my charcoal pencil to start a new sketch, I know one thing for certain. You can steal a woman's house, and you can steal her name, but you can never steal the fire that built them. Some people are born to inherit. I was born to build. And this time, I'm building something that no one, not even those I love, will ever be able to touch.